Hi there, my name is Steve Lilley. I'm president and co-founder of Protocase Incorporated, and I'd like to welcome you to a short introductory video on Protocase Designer. This is our free downloadable CAD software that allows you to very quickly and efficiently design your own custom enclosure, get a price quote online very quickly, and be able to place your order. We make it as simple and as efficient as we possibly can for you. So what we're going to do today is a very simple, straightforward enclosure that will allow you to mount a couple of electronic components inside your enclosure. I picked a couple of real standard common electronic components today. One simply is a motherboard out of a computer, has a standard form factor, ATX form factor, which will become important to us in a little bit later on as we get through the demonstration, and also just a standard hard drive. So this is just a typical hard drive you'd find in any computer, and that's going to be the components that we're going to mount inside our enclosure. Before we get started, I think it's probably appropriate just to have a look at what the final enclosure is going to look like, so that you can get a perspective of what we're going to be building beforehand. So we'll start with that. So this is actually Protocase Designer. I've already designed the enclosure. You can see I've given a little bit of highlights. So it's a yellow rack mount enclosure with a gray front panel. I'm going to quickly take the cover off so you can see the inside of the enclosure. So in here, you can see that there's a number of dots, which are actually mechanical mounting fixtures called standoffs. If you zoom in, you can see that they stand off of the enclosure surface. Those are what you'd use to mount the ATX motherboard. And also in the back here, we have two brackets, and these are what we've put together to allow you to mount the hard drive. So you'll see there's two holes on the bottom of each bracket, which mounts to the floor of the enclosure, and then two holes on the sides, which take up the holes of the hard drive. So that's essentially what we're going to do, and I'm going to show you very quickly and very easily how fast you can do it and how easily you can do it. Okay, so there's a little bit of preparation work that you want to do before you actually start designing your enclosure. And basically what you need to do is you need to get some measurements of your mounting holes and mounting dimensions. On this motherboard, fortunately this is a standard form factor. It's called an ATX motherboard, and that means the mounting holes that are on this motherboard are common and standard to any other motherboard of the same form factor. So we actually don't have to make the measurements of the hole locations or hole sizes on this board, and you'll see why in a few minutes. As for the hard drive, we actually are going to take a few measurements of this because you saw the bracket that we're going to be using to mount it to. We need to know where the actual mounting holes are located and the size of the mounting holes and what have you. So one of the things I did beforehand, I looked to check to see what size screws have to go into these holes on the hard drive. They have to be a number 4 hole, which if you look in any, you can look online and see what a clearance hole size is for a number 4 screw. Turns out that an 1/8 inch hole will do the job for you. So we'll keep that in mind as we move forward. We'll also, the other thing you probably want to have on hand is a digital measuring device called digital caliper. This allows you to very accurately measure the dimensions between holes and hole sizes and what have you. So I guess you could use a ruler if you have to. Often what you'll find is the hole dimensions and hole locations are done on a very common distance. For instance, the holes between these two mounting fixtures are exactly 4 inches. So you probably get a pretty good indication of a ruler that you're on target, but digital calipers are the way to go to get a very accurate measurement. So I've taken the measurements of this hard drive. We know that the mounting holes are 4 inches apart, and we know that they are about 1/4 of an inch off the bottom of the enclosure. So we know how, of the hard drive. So we know how high up we have to make the mounting holes on our bracket. So with that information, we can go ahead and start designing our enclosure. Okay, so I have Protocase Designer has been opened on my computer, and the first thing we want to do is open a new file. So we go to File, New, and then we will select the type of enclosure we're going to make. So inside Protocase Designer, we have all kinds of different templates that you can choose from. In the case of this design, we are going to build a fairly standard type enclosure, which is a rack mount. Very common in the electronics industry. You'll see them in the audio industry. Basically, it's a standard form factor, 19-inch wide enclosure. Ours will have handles on the front for lifting and mounting. And yeah, very simple and straightforward. So we're going to click on a standard rack mount. And when you do that, you get a bunch of options that you can look at just to set the basic template for what you're going to work with. You can choose the material that you're working with, the colors of the various faces of the enclosure, how high it's going to be and how deep it's going to be. In the case of rack mount enclosures, the standard that the height are measured in is called a U. So a 1 U is equal to 1.75 inches. So a 2 U enclosure would be 3.5 inches high, and I'm fine with that. We're going to go with a 15-inch deep enclosure, which is fine. I think what we're going to do, just to add a little life to it, we're going to change the default color of the enclosure from kind of a boring gray to a, let's make it a nice bright yellow. So we'll get to see some nice colors on the screen. Just to show you some of the other things you can do, you can choose the material and thickness of the material of all the various pieces of the enclosure, and the colors of the various pieces. So the front panel in this case we'll use the default color. I'm going to change that back to a gray just so you can see the difference. You can select handles or no handles on your enclosure. We'll keep it with handles. Just that's very common and very standard. So we click OK, and then what we should get is a representation of the enclosure that we're going to build, or at least the template. So there's our enclosure. You can see it has the gray front panel. The rest of the enclosure is yellow. Front panel cover, the main enclosure section itself, and then the rear panel you can see as well. One of the things that I typically like to do when I'm working on an enclosure is I remove the cover so we can have a good look at what we're working on the inside of the enclosure. So over on the right-hand side of the program, you can see Show Hide Parts. So I'm simply just going to click Cover so we can take the cover off, and now you have a good look at what's inside. So the first thing I'm going to do is we'll start with the motherboard. So the way Protocase Designer works is it's based on face editing. So when I want to apply cutouts or I want to apply mounting fixtures or whatever they may be, I need to select the face at which I'm going to work on. So this motherboard is going to mount on the base of the enclosure. So this will be the face that I want to start with. So to do that, you can go up to the the left-hand toolbar, and under the Edit function, you can see Edit Face. So if we click on that, and then we come back and we click on the face being the base of the enclosure we want to edit, what comes up is a two-dimensional representation of the base of the enclosure. So inside here, I can now start to work, and I can start to add mounting fixtures and what have you. Some other things to note. It's often very advantageous to be able to put a grid on your base so that you can kind of get a feel for a general idea of where you're working. And there's also a snap function, so I can turn on the grid. I can apply a snap function, which basically allows my cursor to jump from point to point to point. Makes it a little bit easier when you're working with the editor. So I don't always, but I'm going to turn on the snap function. This grid size is pretty detailed right now. You can change that if you want. I'm going to open this up to just, let's say, 1/2 inch by 1/2 inch. And you'll see what that'll do for us. Just opens it up a bit. Depending on how precise you're trying to place components with the snap feature on, it will determine how dense you want to make your grid size. So one of the things you can do, what we've done to make life really, really simple for our users, is to build a common cutout library. So we have a cutout library which contains all kinds of common cutouts. You can also use it to create your own custom cutouts, which you can save into the library as well. So one of the things I'm going to show you first is how easy it is to mount the motherboard, being the ATX form factor. So if I call up the cutout library and I go into the cutout library, as you see here, a cutout library. So what we have in our main library is all kinds of different headings for the types of cutouts that you can choose from. For instance, you can see fans. We have a whole series of different pre-cut or pre-designed fan cutouts. For the motherboard, if we go into hardware and we click down, we can see under computer hardware a variety of different cutouts, but we see a number of different ATX cutout patterns. So if I click through these, it gives you, on the right-hand side, you can see the approximation of what they look like, or I guess exactly what they look like. And this happens to be the same form factor for the motherboard that we are going to mount in our enclosure. So we can simply select that by placing the item. Up comes the representation of the cutout, and I could just place this anywhere on my enclosure base. Once that's on there, you can refine it more accurately to your requirements afterwards, but suffice it to say, it's on there now and we've got it in place to be able to mount our motherboard. So if I just accept that change by clicking the checkbox up here in the top left, you can then see that it's placed all the mounting hardware that I need inside the enclosure to mount that motherboard. One thing of note on this one, and I'm just going to go back into the face editor, and I'm going to go back and look at it. As you can see, when I click on this, it remains a complete entity. Now, interestingly enough, when I looked at the actual motherboard itself, it doesn't have this one mounting hole down here. But that's not a problem. We can actually go and we can custom this template, and we can take that mounting fixture out if we want, that standoff. And the way you do that is once you click on the item to edit, you can come over here and there's a button called Ungroup. So if you click Ungroup, that basically takes that as one item and turns that into all of its subcomponents. So now what I can actually do is I can select that one mounting fixture, and I can actually, just by hitting delete, I can just delete that out of there. And then all of a sudden it will work perfectly for me when I go to mount my motherboard inside. So the next thing, as you may recall when we looked at the enclosure from the start, was we had two mounting brackets to mount our hard drive. So that's the next thing I'm going to work on. And actually what you can do is you can actually create those brackets separately from the enclosure, and you can save them and then bring them in through the cutout library when you want. So that's what I'm going to do next. I'm just going to show you quickly how you can make that bracket. So what I will do here now is I'm going to want to create a new part, but to do that I need to save my existing project first. So I'm going to say yes to save. I'm going to call this video demo. Let's call it video demo 1. Click save. And then what happens is I get the option to create a new enclosure, or in this case, what we're going to do is a new bracket. So inside Protocase Designer is the ability to create all different kinds of brackets. We have angled brackets, we have half brackets, and we have L brackets. So in the case of what we're trying to do here, it's going to be an L bracket. You can see what you have to do is you have to give it your basic parameters based on the guidelines above. So we are going to make this one, let's say, a width of 1 inch, depth of, let's say, 5 inches, because the mounting holes have to be 4 inches apart, and the height only really needs to be 1 inch as well. And if we select OK, there we have the bracket. Now the only thing we need to do there is we need to add some mounting holes on the bottom and 2 mounting holes on the side to take up the screws that will screw in directly to the hard drive and mount the hard drive to the side of the bracket. So to do that, we go back into Edit Face, select the face we want to edit. I will definitely turn on my grid and I'll snap to grid. The size in this case is 0.2 inches. Make it easy, I'm just going to change that to 0.25. I think, and same with this one. So this will just give us 1/4 inch spacing on our grid. And then, so what I need to do is I need to apply 2, as you recall, we looked at the clearance hole size for those screws, which is an 1/8 inch hole. So I'm going to add 2 holes to the enclosure in to the bracket in the approximate areas where I want them to be. So I just start with under cutout, I'm going to select a circle. I'm going to apply a circle here. Doesn't really matter the size for now. I'm going to apply another one over here. And once I have those 2 in place, I can go back and I can edit them to be exactly what I want. So if I click on this one here, for instance, you can see that it has a diameter of 0.5 inches. Well, that only needs to be 0.125 inches, or 1/8 of an inch. So I change that there and hit enter. And there we go. So we now have our our mounting hole, which is the right size to as a clearance hole to get our screw through. We will do the same thing for the other hole as well, 0.125, and there we go. And we would position those so that they are exactly 4 inches apart, which I believe they probably are. Click OK, and there we see our, in actual fact, these are our side ones, so that will be 4 inch apart. So the other thing I need to do is I need to put 2 mounting holes down on the bottom face as well. These ones I can put at whatever distance apart I want, which is convenient because I will put the necessary mounting hardware on the base of the enclosure to accommodate where these holes are. So if I just go back and I select Edit Face, select this particular, and here we go. Again, I'm going to turn on the grid and snap. I'm going to place 2 cutouts approximately where they need to be, both circles. Actually, I'm going to draw these ones in a little bit from where the other 2 were, just so we don't have any interference from the side mounting holes to the base mounting holes. It'll just make sure we're in better shape. Again, back to another circle. Oops. Done. And again, we will change those diameters to 1/8 of an inch. And also 1/8 of an inch. And hopefully, we're good to go. Good. So now you can see I've offset these a little bit just so that when the screw is going in there, there won't be any interference with the stud that will be coming up to the hole here on the base of the bracket. So now, you may recall that what I showed you was these brackets mounted inside the enclosure. So what we need to do now is, instead of having this as a separate part, we need to create this part as a sub-assembly of something else, i.e. our enclosure, our rack mount enclosure. So to do that, what we do, there's a function called under the cutout library manager, we can create a sub-assembly. So that's this function here. So I click that. And if you notice over here on the right-hand side, it says click a face to attach a sub-assembly. So what I need to do is I need to tell the system which face will be mounting to the face inside my enclosure. So in order to do that, you can see my mouse. So if I come down here, this is the face that I want to have mount to the base of the enclosure. So if I click on that face, it then brings up the save button for new library item. This one's called L bracket front bottom. I'll just say, let's call it just, I'm fine with that name. We'll just say demo. Click OK. And now that's been created. So, and actually if I go in and I look at my cutout library, we should be able to see that part now inside our cutout library, probably at the very bottom. So here we have L bracket by front bottom demo. So there's our part. It's stored into our library. So we're good to go from that standpoint. So now let's go back and open up our, I'm going to save this part as well. Just in case I ever want to use it as an actual part again. So I want to go back and open my existing enclosure, which I called Video Demo 1. So this goes through the process of actually checking the design to make sure that that everything that you've put into your design is manufacturable from our standpoint. So if it sees any errors, it will actually highlight those errors and let you know as the customer what those errors are. You can ignore them if you want, but you also have the option then to go back and change those. So it looks to me like the analysis is good. There's no problems with our design so far. So here we are. We have our enclosure back. Again, I'm going to take the cover off. I'm going to go back into edit this base of the enclosure, which brings up my 2D editor screen. And now what I want to do, I'm going to turn my grid back on. Actually, you know what? I don't actually need the grid here right now. Sorry. Yes, I am. Now what I want to do is go into my cutout library. And again, as you recall, that bracket is inside my cutout library. I go down and select that, place item. Now it gives you the options to change some of the parameters. I'm not going to do that. I'm fine with the overall dimensions as we design them. And there you can see my bracket. And I'm going to put a second one on because it takes two brackets to mount the hard drive. So we see those two brackets there. They're both facing the same direction, so it's clear that one of them is going to need to be rotated, and it's this one here. And the way you do that is you can just right-click on the part, click Rotate, and then you can state the degree rotation that you want. Go rotate this 180 degrees, and there you can see that's now rotated. And when I actually save that and look at it, you'll see there's my two brackets. Obviously, those brackets are too close together to hold the hard drive. So actually, what we need to do here, because there's no more room inside the enclosure, we can go back and we can edit some of the overall parameters and dimensions of the enclosure. So I'm going to do that right now because it's just not long enough. So I'm going to add about 5 inches to the length of this enclosure, and I'm going to show you how we do that. Under Edit, there's Edit Enclosure Properties. So this just goes back to the very original screen when we created the new enclosure, and see where the depth was 15 inches. I'm going to change that to 20 inches so that hopefully we will now have an enclosure that's long enough to accommodate the 4 inches required to mount the hard drive. It's a bit of a computational issue for the software, because it has to recalculate a bunch of stuff. But now you can see the enclosure is much longer. And if you look inside now, it's clear we have the room to open up the space between these two brackets so that we can accommodate the hard drive. Now, to do things in the essence of time, I'm just going to very quickly go into that face editor. Now what you'd want to do is you want to precisely separate these by 4 inches. Now that can easily be done by putting on your grid. You don't necessarily need the snap. Opening up the grid spacing to, say, 1/2 inch. Oops. Click OK. And then we can actually take these components and we can just move them so that we know we have them right on a 4-inch spacing. So not going to get into the heavy detail on that, but you can see even through the snap feature you can do that. You can separate these by 4 inches. So now you can see we're all set. We can mount our hard drive in here, we can mount our motherboard, and we're good to go. There. So that's the key elements of the design of the enclosure. Now there's some other things I want to take you through in terms of a cutout library and our custom cutout editor. So for example, our front panel, we may want to mount a on-off rocker switch on the front panel. You've got to turn the thing on, you've got to turn it off. So what we would do in that case is if we know the dimensions of the switch, we can just simply we can design a cutout to do that, or we can see if that template for that particular rocker switch is in our library. So we can simply go to our cutout library. We look at switches, and under rocker switches you can see a series of different switches that are available. This, I believe, is the one that we were using, so I can select that, place that switch cutout on my enclosure face, and everything looks good there. Now, one issue: you put a switch on your enclosure, how do you know what's on and what's off? So inside Protocase Designer, we have the capability of adding graphics. You can import your logos, which would be digitally printed on the front or whatever face of your enclosure. But to make it simple for us, I'm just going to add a little bit of graphics that you can have silkscreened on your enclosure or digitally printed on your enclosure. So if I look at the left menu, this time we go under Graphic. First thing that comes up is my choice of whether I want to do a direct digital print or silk screening. I'm actually just going to choose direct digital print. It's simple and it's straightforward. It allows you to do the most complex types of graphics, blended colors and what have you. So that's my choice. And I'm going to write some text. So what I do is I click text, click generally in the area where I want to put it. In this case, it's going to be an on, and it's going to be an off. And once I have those on there, I can just go back on each one, and I can position them where they need to be, centered and over the cutout. So I'm happy with that. I'm basically happy with the color I see there. That should probably turn out okay. You can go in, this is a Pantone blue color that we have. You can change these colors. We have a bunch of fixed colors that we use from our silk screening process. Digital print, you're much more free to use a variety of different colors. I accept this, and then what we should see is there we have our graphics on our enclosure with our cutout for our rocker switch. Okay. So another thing that I like to talk about is heat gets generated inside these enclosures. So in a lot of cases you want to be able to provide some ventilation. You may have some fans that you're going to install to facilitate air movement. So one thing I'm going to show you is how we would use our cutout library to install some fans. In this case we're going to mount them on the back of the enclosure. So we'll go to Edit Face, this time the rear panel. I'm going to turn on my grid this time again and snap back into my cutout library, and if I scroll down I will find a series of fans right here, general fans. Again, when you click on these you get an indication of what it's going to look like. A standard 40 millimeter cutout fan is perfect for the rear panel of these enclosures, so I'm going to select this one. And as you can see, we'll just place a few of these on the rear of our enclosure and accept that. And there we go. We have some fan cutouts in the back of our enclosure. It's great. We're coming along. One other thing you may want to do is you may want to create your own very custom cutout to be able to apply. I'm going to show you how to do that in a very simple fashion by providing some ventilation on the sides of the enclosure. So what I'm going to do in this case, I'm going to select one of the sides of the enclosure. I'm going to go into my cutout library again, but in this case I'm going to tell the system that instead of picking an item out of the library, I want to create a new item. So I'm going to go down here to this button and say New Item. So the first thing the system asks me is, where do I want the origin of this overall cutout to be? For the purposes of this one, I'm actually going to select the center of the overall cutout. I'm going to change the template size for the cutout from 1 inch to 2 inches because I just want the cutout to be just a little bit less than 2 inches, and select OK. You'll see in a sec why I did that. So what I see then is a new two-dimensional cutout palette here for us. And again, I'm going to turn the grid on. I'm going to snap the grid, and I'm going to make this small grid size. I'm going to take this down to 0.1 by 0.1. Say OK. And here's a really simple cutout that we can create. So what I'm going to choose is I'm going to do a complex path. I mean, you can just do a circle or whatever, and you can add numerous circles to this as well, or numerous cutouts, which will end up being one single cutout when all is said and done. But I'm going to create a path here, and I'm going to start with you can use a line or arc, and I'm going to start with a simple line. And I'm just going to draw a line up here, and you'll see where I'm going with this in a few minutes. Yeah, so we'll start with that, and I'll convert over to an arc, and I'll show the radius that I want to put in it. Go back to a line, I'll come down here, back to an arc. I'm going to close it up with the arc, show the radius, and there you have. It's basically just an angled ventilation slot that we can then place onto the sides of our enclosure. If I accept this, I'm good, and then you will see that that item, which is just listed as a new item, is there for me now to place on the enclosure. So if I go place item, I can do that. I'm actually going to turn my grid and snap back on, and I can drop one or many of those onto the side of the enclosure. I'm just going to throw 5 on for now, because then back in the edit mode, I can then just go and grab all of those as a group. Through your standard Control-C, Control-V, I can then copy and paste a group of those onto the side of my enclosure. That's good. I'll take one at a time just to finish off the side. And one more, and we should be good. Accept those, and there you go. You can see a whole series of angled ventilation slots on the side of the enclosure. So obviously I could go and do exactly the same to the other side, which I would do to give it balance. And once I'm done, I then have my completed enclosure. Close things up, I can put the cover back on. And then one last thing I want to show you, the most important part for you, would be to determine how much I'm going to have to pay for this and to go ahead and place my order. So if you look up here under Instant Quotes and Purchasing, you just click on Instant Quote, and then you'll see that up comes your web page, which basically outlines your quote. You can see the price of the unit, the setup fees associated with it, and then your total price. Once you have that and you're happy with the price, you can go ahead and click Order, and the process will take you through to actually placing the order. I'm not going to do it here because it will actually put an order into our system, and I don't need to have this enclosure built for us right now. So that concludes the demonstration, a very quick introduction demonstration of Protocase Designer. I hope this has been helpful to you, and thank you for your time.